Hello, everybody. Jan Rutherford here with Self-Reliant Leadership. Glad you're with us. And as I start today, I just want to say, if you're with us, I would love for you to put in the chat where you're calling in from. We were on earlier this week. We had people from all over the world. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I've got a very special guest today, April. And April just published this book, August 24th, and we're going to talk all about this. It's 8 Superpowers for Thriving in Constant Change. And we all know we are dealing with a lot of change, both personally and professionally in our organization. So we're going to talk to April. And before I bring her on, just a quick intro. April is one of the 50 leading female futurists in the world by Forbes. She's worked with organizations like Airbnb, Nike, Intuit, World Bank, Nesta, Trove, Any Road, Unsettled. She's holds a degree from Harvard, a law degree, and boy, she's had such a variety of experiences. Global development executive, microfinance lawyer, investor, mental health advocate, certified yoga teacher, globetrotter, has been to 100 countries, worked in 50 of them. And the thing I want to know most, and I'm going to bring April on right now. April, what is an insatiable handstander?
Oh, goodness. Hi, Jan. It's great to be here. So I have been doing handstands most of my life. I did gymnastics as a kid, and then something happened. All my friends stopped doing handstands, and I somehow kept doing them. So today, far beyond my years, I am still doing handstands, and anytime I travel around the world or closer to home, I will do handstands. So it got to be such a kind of addiction that I have a webpage up with all my handstands from, the Colosseum at Rome, the pyramids of Giza, random places where I've done handstands. So it's kind of like my travel signature.
Wow. I don't think I've ever done a handstand. And now you're making me think that's a goal I should have is to do a handstand.
Well, I call it actually my upside down perspective on life, which actually relates to FLUX. And so it travels well, I gotta say. And also just a side note, all kinds of studies out there that show that inversions, so whether it's a headstand or a handstand or just flipping upside down, improves your mental acuity, improves your longevity. Like, we all need to be going upside down every now and again.
Wow. Oh, that's cool. Well, I'm glad you're with us. And again, to all the people listening, if you could put in the comments where you're calling in from, we'd love to see. And any questions you've got along the way, I do my very best to get those questions in front of April and answer those for you. And again, just to remind everybody, this book came out August 24th. It's doing really well. You've got endorsements that are off the charts. Dan Pink, Seth Godin, Adam Grant, all these folks. And I'm always curious when I meet an author is, a lot of people ask, who's the book for? What's it about? And I'm going to get into that. But I kind of want to know the origin story. Where did this boil up with? I want to write a book someday, and then I migrated to this, or this topic is the thing you always wanted to write about?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Jan. And thank you all for being here. I'm just really excited to join this conversation in this community. So the origin story of FLUX is actually, I'd like to think it's pretty interesting in that I like to tell people I've been working on FLUX for the last, actively writing it for the last 3 years. So that's point one. I didn't write it about 2020. I didn't write it about the pandemic, even though both things were incredible validation for my ideas and sort of accelerated my writing process. But I was looking at FLUX long before. And I think I've long had a fascination with our sort of humans' relationship to change and how messy and complicated it is. Yeah. And I sort of take 3 lenses. So the first is that of a futurist, where I'm looking at how are people and their organizations looking at the future and how they fit into it, and a world and a future in flux. And I kept seeing that every single organization on the planet struggles with change.
Right.
And then my second lens is this global lens, which, thanks to my career and as you've explained, I've spent most of my life overseas and just spending time with all kinds of different people, cultures, places. And I discovered that every single culture struggles with change, but also has developed different ways of seeing it and talking about it, and coming up with rituals and concepts. And there's so much we can learn from one another. And so I wanted to help connect those dots.
Yeah.
And then the third lens is the one that, I think this is where, who's the book for? I'm like, it's for everyone.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that, because it has value for everyone, in that I was really interested in human relationships to change, and the emotions and anxieties and all the bundle of feelings that we have around change.
Yeah.
And in that regard, it's very much my origin story. So 3 years writing the book, but I like to say it's been more like almost 3 decades in the making.
Yeah.
And in that regard, my entry into FLUX, and I think where I started getting interested in it, even though I never would have said I would write a book about it back then, but when I was 20 years old, both of my parents died in a car accident. And that was my wake up of like, what do you do when you don't know what to do? What do you do when the future you thought you were going to have just kind of melts? And from that point, that's really the origin story of my quest to better understand our relationship to change. And then, it just keeps layering year by year, and change isn't going anywhere. So it was time to write the book.
Wow. Do you have siblings?
I do. So I have one older sister, one biological sister who I went through my parents' death and all that with.
Yeah.
And she's fabulous. But I always have to caveat this now, because I lost my parents. So I don't have the 2 people that I was closest to. But over the years since, I've actually developed a much larger extended family of choice. And it's sort of no one officially adopted me, so to speak, but adopted family. And so I actually have additional siblings that I say they are my siblings, even though we didn't, grow up together per se.
Yeah. Yeah. I have my sister-in-law, I consider a sister, and I've got another sister that's, I consider a dear friend. Also, I want to welcome the people that have signed in, where you're calling in from. It looks like I've got one of my MBA students is in, Tim. Hey, welcome, Tim. A good friend out in Raleigh, North Carolina, Al. And, we've got people from California, and somebody calling in from Egypt. So
awesome.
Welcome, everybody. Speaking of the world and flux and change and humans, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the National Museum of Natural History, and I went through the exhibit on evolution. And it was interesting, as we look at the evolution of time of humans. And, it's kind of like this line of no change. And then 12,000 years ago, we started farming, and then, everything changed. And I'm wondering, as you look at this from a big picture perspective, is there any wonder we're having so much trouble with change? Because we humans, it sure looks like for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we had almost no change. We got up, we found food, we procreated, we died. I mean, it sounds like it was a pretty simple life. Now there's all these complexity with modern civilization. I mean, is that something that you thought about writing this?
Oh yeah, lots.
Yeah.
A lot. And I think a couple different, lenses again that I'll put on this. We can tease this out. And I love kind of stretching the boundaries of how we think and how we might think differently and what we hadn't thought of before. And, the way that I like to phrase it is actually change has existed as, throughout time immemorial. Technically, like the only reason you and I are here is because of change, right? Something had to change for us to actually come into the world. And yet, I think I look back and sort of long ago, there was still change. I mean, there was a much bigger threat to your survival on a daily basis. There were things you needed to changes or factors that you needed to react and respond to quite a bit. But the pace of change and how much is changing, how fast,
right,
and how much, that's everything from how much information we're trying to absorb to how long it takes. I mean, classic case is just the concept of the Industrial Revolution, right? The first Industrial Revolution, which wasn't that long ago, right? 200-ish years ago, took roughly 100 years to take root. Now, that was a massive amount of change, but it happened over 5 generations, right? Today, we're in the so-called fourth industrial revolution, whatever you want to make of that. And we don't have an exact time frame on it because we're in it. But you can say 10 to 20 years, we're going to go through the same magnitude of change.
Yep.
And no one knows what's next. And, the pace of change, the way that I frame it in the book is that the pace of change has never been as fast as it is today. And yet it is likely to never again be this slow. And you let that settle in for a minute and you go,
Wow.
like, that's kind of exciting. It's also kind of terrifying, right? Because we're just running ever faster and like, when does this end and so forth. And that starts to get into our relationships and some of these flux superpowers. But that's kind of where I tease it out. I actually am of the mindset that we've never been without change, but it's this piece of change and what society tells us we're supposed to do about change versus certain aspects of what the human condition is naturally inclined or designed to do when it comes to keeping up and react, respond, manage change, all of that.
Well, I think, what you said is really profound. It's never going to be this slow again. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, when I take people out on expeditions, the takeaway is always the same. You have to slow down to speed up. I mean, the whole idea of being out in nature is, oh my gosh, I get to slow down. I get the digital detox. So, as well as you can prognosticate, the big picture, what's this mean, for those that are listening, in their careers, hey, I'm in my 30s and I'm doing this, or I'm in my 40s. What's this mean, over the next few decades for people? And again, we'd love to hear any questions you've got specific to this.
Yeah, it's a great, and I mean, we can talk about how this plays out for you individually in your personal life, in your professional life, in your career, in your organization, in your family, in your community. I mean, it's we can go to any layer of abstraction, so to speak.
Right.
But I want to pick up on a couple things, and actually, you've already harked into the first of the 8 flux superpowers about slowing down. So
I got my list here.
We can come back to that. Yeah. But I also like to always make a shout out that nature is one of the best teachers of flux, not just how we navigate through it, but things like water and bamboo and whatnot. When you think about how they grow and thrive, and you can't control them, water has no shape of its own, yet it can cut through rock. Like that's very fluxy, as I would say. And there's so many different teachers that we have for this. So how you look at this, I mean, this is really the central message of the book, is that in a world and a future that is full of more uncertainty, not more certainty, more instability, not more stability, more more change and more flux, that we need to, and I'll even say radically, reshape our relationship to it to have a healthy and productive outlook.
Yeah.
And so that plays out in lots of different ways. I mean, there's a chapter about how we need to rethink how we think about our careers and design them, and how we talk about them and curate them and so forth. There's another superpower chapter that's about trust and how hard it is. Change hits. What do you trust? What do you do? What do you do when you don't know what to do? So the book is a kind of deep dive into, there's very much a reflective process that goes on to figure out what is your relationship like to change today, and what aspects of it might need to improve. What parts are most difficult for you? Because what's lovely is everyone can improve their relationship to change, but not everyone needs the same kind of help. And so much of that comes from, what were you raised to think about change? Was it exciting and adventure, or was it danger and a threat? How do you feel about the unknown? How do you feel about letting go? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, there's a quote you've got, is how much you carry is enough. And again, I'm thinking about, particularly young people that are at a point when they're trying to decide, do I want a job? Do I want a career? Do I want to pursue a calling? And how do I manage all this stuff? And, there's things of concern. There's things I can influence. There's things I can control. When you were writing that, when you were saying, how much you could carry is enough and determining that. What was behind that? Was there a message like, don't be so hard on yourself?
For sure. So know you're enough is one of the 8 FLUX superpowers, which says basically this is getting at our obsession with more.
Right.
And so long, and think about this in any way, but like I love the way this sort of tagline, when we're always after more money, more power, more prestige, more loves, more likes, more followers, more whatever, right? When we're always after more, we will never find enough. It's impossible, because once you found whatever you're looking for, you need more. However, when you know you're enough, which includes knowing that you are enough, you will immediately begin to see abundance. And it's a fascinating, I mean, there's a lot in the book that's counterintuitive and a little bit contrarian and provocative and all the rest. But I will actually, this one superpower, this one concept resonates well with lots of ages and demographics, but I would say especially young professionals, where they're saying, I want a different kind of life and work life and lifestyle. And I don't want this excess. And what's fascinating to me, and it's just kind of reminding me of it right now, when I lost my parents, I was 20, which is a really interesting age because I was old enough to be able to take care of myself on a day-to-day basis. And I was away at college and so forth. But I was young enough that I had no idea really how the world worked or what my career was going to look like. But thinking about what you do, all of a sudden I had to be self-reliant. I had to be self-sufficient. I had to figure out, what do I do, right? And I didn't have a backstop. Honestly, it was really like, put one foot in front of the other and let's get going. And what I realized was that I started to observe at that time this obsession with more. And it didn't sit well with me because I was kind of like, any one of us could die tomorrow. And I don't think the thing we're most proud of is that I went after more. I mean, more in terms of contribution to society.
Yeah. Can you say more about, abundance? Because actually, we had a podcast go live today of an interview with Kim Cameron from University of Michigan, who talks about positivity, and his whole theory is the theory of abundance. And again, it sounds great. I'm wondering if you can attach some pragmatic views. When somebody says, again, knowing this, then you start to see abundance. I wonder if we can, kind of get a grip on that rather than it be, a little bit touchy-feely.
Sure. So the way that I've not just designed the book, but the way that I find is most helpful, and whether it's understanding our relationship to change, which also feels a little like mushy, but also understanding what's your enough, right? Most people have never actually set any kind of baseline in that regard. Like, what is your enough? Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever? And what's fascinating is that when we talk about enough, in my experience and research and whatnot, we usually focus first and foremost on money. Do you have enough money? And everyone could sort of play around with that number, I suppose. What's fascinating is when you actually sit down with a lot of numbers, for a lot of people, they're enough. And when I say enough, what is the amount of money that would allow you to basically care for your basic needs and be content? Not too much and not too little. But I'm not talking about excess. I'm not talking about a society that says your next promotion has to include a raise. I'm saying, what's your enough, right? It's actually a lot lower than most people think. And it's fascinating because when we're going after, I need more and more, you need more because you want to typically buy more stuff, but not the kind of stuff that necessarily makes you happy. So I often start it by saying, have you thought about your enough? But key, beyond finances, I think this is where we are almost as a society over-indexed on the financial and material obsession with more. But we're actually living in a lot of in a lot of scarcity when it comes to emotional and spiritual enough, right? So a lot of people don't have, emotionally, they're running a deficit. So think about the different kinds of enough and where you might have a little too much and where you might have a little too little. And for example, the example that seems to come up quite a lot is if you're able to be raised in, an emotionally stable household, even without not a lot of resources, that will actually set you up to have not just enough, but an abundance of emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
an abundance of care and giving to give to others as an adult.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's all that kind of stuff.
You make me think of the mountain guides that we work with.
Mm.
You know, most of them are Renaissance men and women.
Mhm.
I mean, they're highly educated. They know a lot about a lot. And you get out there and their gears, you know, all put together with duct tape. You know, it's all falling apart. And they talk a lot about that they've really spent a lot of time thinking about time and money. And they're living intentionally and purposefully. And it's interesting, the executives that come out oftentimes have brand new gear, the best gear, and they're going to use it once. And they're thinking, you know, you are a stressed out mess. You know, you've got all this money. I don't have any money. I'm at peace. And it's really a striking contrast. And, you know, one of your 8 points in the book, and I think this segues into it pretty well, is create your portfolio career. So, you know, I guess, I mean, is it, you know, I'm going to go be a mountain guide for, you know, a couple of years, and then I'm going to go do yoga, and then I'm going to go back to Wall Street. I mean, what's your thinking there?
So I love this. Thank you so much, Jen. And you're bang on. And I don't know if this was in the bio that you read. I actually spent several years as a hiking and biking guide.
I didn't know that.
I know exactly the people you're talking about. And I always like to say it was actually the best job I ever had. Loved it. It wasn't the career that I wanted over the long term, but it taught me so much about, I will say respectfully, the personalities you're talking about. And for me as a guide, and I wasn't going to do it I knew I wasn't going to do it long term, but to see that contrast between how different people prioritize different things and how do you define your enough, right? They were defining it very differently, and I'm not going to judge one as good or bad or anything, but those guides were much closer to their enough. And when they needed to pivot or do something else or whatnot, they had a much easier time of doing it, because on the one hand, you could say their overhead was less, but they also were really clear on what mattered and what didn't. So that's just a fun anecdote from my guiding days as well.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
And guiding does fit into my portfolio. So back to, or over to that, when I say the superpower that is, as I define it, in a world in flux, the way to have success professionally is to think about your career not as a linear path to pursue, a sort of study, work, retire, like if, you know, A, B, C, it's, I'm going to pursue this path,
right?
And rather as a portfolio to curate. So this concept of a portfolio career is really, really cool. I'm just going to say, I can say now, you know, I always wanted a portfolio career, and I actually ended up pursuing one, but I did so at a time where there wasn't language to talk about it that way. And it was typically stigmatized, and people told me I was distracted and my resume made no sense and all that sort of stuff. Now I just realized, no, I had a different view of how we put together our professional identity and how we contribute to the world, including earning income and making a, you know, reputation for yourself and so forth. So I'm looking at portfolio career. It's both in terms of people who really want a different way of working and being in the world.
Yeah.
It's also related to certain future of, you know, the future of work trends, which is climbing the corporate ladder. You know, the corporate ladder itself is sort of teetering. It's not actually doing that well these days. It's doing all right for a few people, but a lot of people are discovering they don't want to climb the ladder, or they feel stuck on the ladder, and they don't feel a sense of meaning and purpose, and they don't know where the ladder ends, etc. Think over the last year, if we want to put this in context of 2020 and the Great Resignation and all of that, more than half of all employees are considering leaving their employer by the end of this year. Like, that's a shocking number. That is a clear signal to me that the current, you know, career path, singular linear pursuit isn't working for a lot of people, including also things around flexibility and whatnot. So the concept of a portfolio, it's more of a concept of how we think about what our career could look like. So back to, you know, somebody who's a guide and spent time on Wall Street and, you know, maybe taken some years off to parent, actually, I wouldn't say off. I would say actually that is as valuable. That is one of the most valuable pieces in your portfolio, or your parenting skills. All of it makes sense to me because it's all in your portfolio. Now, if you put it on a traditional CV, people would be like, "Ooh, that doesn't make sense. Connect those dots," right? Part of what you have to do is actually tell the narrative of how your portfolio evolved, but it ends up being a strategy that is much more aligned with what you're good at, what you want, kind of your ikigai, if you're familiar with that concept.
Yeah.
But it's also, if you think about who else has portfolios, artists have portfolios that they put their best work in. Investors have portfolios that are designed to diversify and mitigate risk. So when you're pursuing this singular path and it doesn't go to plan, you can often be in a really tough spot. You don't know what to do. You've lost your professional identity. It's kind of like crisis. When you've got a portfolio, you're actually able to mix, match, recombine different skills, different roles, different things you like to do in a different way that opens up opportunities as well. Hence, useful for a world in flux.
Yeah, this is awesome, and we're getting some questions coming in from my buddy, my brother, from another mother, Al Paxton, out in. How do you balance a professional and personal life as flux continues to accelerate?
Yeah,
with a mindset of abundance, and and just so you know, Al is one of the finest leaders I have ever met in my life. So.
Yeah. Hi, Al. And it's funny, Jan, because in this case too, I'm like, oh, I want to get your input on this as well, because this is really, so when we think about going back to what I was saying about the pace of change. So the fact that flux or change in itself, that the pace of change is accelerating, as a human, I kind of like to say that's a problem in and of itself. Now, as a futurist, I'm saying that's not something we can actually do much about. Like, no one person can control the future. We can only control how we respond. No one person can predict what's going to happen. We can only try to prepare for the different things that might happen, etc. So how do we balance a personal and professional life? There's a big reset that I think actually needs to happen, and it relates to some degree. I mean, a portfolio career is part of the solution, in that how we think about and design our careers can help us actually get off that hamster wheel, or that sense of have to run ever faster. But more broadly, it relates to what we were talking about earlier, this notion of running slower. And so in that regard, that is where I'm looking at it, and beyond your career, beyond the workplace, but just this sense that, and here again, it's counterintuitive and it's not what society tells us, but when we talk about it and we really dig into it, we go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And that is that in an ever faster paced world, the way you thrive is not to run ever faster and just keep up and just keep up and just keep up. We have to reset and learn how to run slower, to slow down our pace of life so that it is sustainable. And I mean, for me, the biggest risk of all is when you're running ever faster. And think about it. I mean, if we follow what society at large tells us to do, and we know the pace of change is getting faster, that means that however fast you're running today, you're going to be running faster tomorrow, and faster than that next week, and faster than that next month. And like, it never ends. And I'm looking at this going, at best, this is burnout and exhaustion. At worst, though, it's no one reaching their full potential. Yeah. So and that is something each of us has to take responsibility for. Yeah. It's not that we get to control it, but society is not going to give this to us. We actually have to say enough is enough, you could say. But also there are lots of ways in which I think technology, mass consumerism, lots of things that they have actually hijacked our time, our attention, our sense of what matters and what doesn't. And when we get that kind of clarity, we actually get time back.
And that's, that's the point you hit on is at the end, I think is where I would weigh in is I think it's really understanding what we hold dear, what we really value. And when we're in conflict, I think it's because we have values conflicting. And if we really understand and prioritize the values, and again, family and work, what's more important, and we're a lot slower to say yes to things. I love Juliet Funt's comment the other day, a meeting request is not a subpoena. You know, I mean, all these requests are not subpoenas. I mean, you don't have to say yes. And I think it's you know, figuring out and drawing boundaries, especially when you're new in a role,
Yeah.
is to really decide what you're going to say yes and no to. Al, great question. And again, if Al, if you have any input, what you think is a great counsel, if you could put it in the comments, I'd love to share that with everybody. Let me show another one.
And
Um,
can I add just a quick footnote here, because it's a sort of pillar of the book, but building on what you just said, one of the questions I like to ask people to kind of help open their flux mindset, what I call flux mindset. What makes you you, even when everything else changes?
yeah.
And that's one of those kind of questions which gets at the heart of what you're talking about. Because if we define ourselves by our professional identity only, we're setting ourselves up for a lot of, you know, a heartbreak and difficulty at some point, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, I love it in an icebreaker to ask people who they are, not what they do. And it's interesting because people struggle with that.
yeah.
Like,
Actually, the book, I have a list. There's a call out box. There's a whole lot of questions, as you've seen, a lot of like interactive exercises and whatnot. And that whole thing on questions that are better to ask than what do you do?
right.
Because it just doesn't fit us who we are. And not, certainly not how a lot of people, I think, want to get to know one another in the first instance.
Yeah. And Michelle asked a great question here. And Michelle, you're reading my mind, because as April was speaking earlier, I was thinking about not only are a whole bunch of people looking for other jobs, but while they're looking or thinking about other jobs, they are not engaged. They are not committed. They're not given 100%. And I've heard so many people over the last year and a half say, I can get my job done in 4 hours. I don't. And so I think we're starting to evaluate really, you know, what are we trading here? You know, you're paying me X amount to deliver results, or you paying me X amount to spend time in front of a computer. And so I think there's a whole thing about time, and there's a lot of old fashioned, you know, expectations that are still out there about what it means to be dedicated and loyal. But you asked, Michelle, how do employers feel about the concept of the portfolio career, given that 50% are leaving? April, what do you think? What do you hear?
Great question, Michelle. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And when you have an unmotivated, sort of checked out worker or talent, they're not going to be coming up with innovative ideas. They're not your future leaders. Like, where's your company going to be in some time? You really start thinking about that broader legacy. So, fascinating question. I think that employers as a whole, I suppose to state the obvious, they're a little freaked out about the Great Resignation for sure. So they're trying to figure out how do we, it's so interesting. I've had debates about, I really hate the word talent acquisition. I don't think we acquire talent, because to acquire somebody is to like own them, but it actually gets at what we're talking about here. Employers can no longer think that they own or possess their talent. What's interesting, as they think about how do we attract talent, retain it, engage it, etc. I find employers are, and I do a fair amount of work, both with employers as well as like universities and people who are trying to prepare people for their careers and whatnot. Everyone seems to love the portfolio concept. They're like, it's fit for a future of work in flux. We can see that. We like that. The challenge becomes obviously, how do we translate that into our own internal operations?
Story.
Exactly. And the biggest thing I find, and I'm actually not going to say, so two things. One is, one of the best things an employer can do right now to keep their talent is to help them understand and create and curate their portfolio. Truly. If an individual feels like they have some latitude to do some different things, they're more likely to stay. It's true. Now, the hook is that immediately for employers, it almost rubs them wrong in every way imaginable, because they're like, that's not how we're designed. And I'm like, you know what? You're going to lose that talent. So it's fascinating, because the answer is embedded in what makes them very, very uncomfortable. But the answer's right there.
You're talking about drivers. I mean, understanding what drives our people. I remember I had a woman that worked for me at one point in her career. She wanted to open a muffin shop. She was an analyst for me. And so I was always giving her stuff on entrepreneurship and all that. She never did open the muffin shop. she became a high-ranking VP in a Fortune 500 company. But I remember thinking, boy, this is counterintuitive, but I'm going to actually motivate her more by helping her get where she wants to go, and she's going to give me 100%. And I mean, I think that's what you're saying.
Exactly, Jan. Yeah. Exactly. And the key that I want to kind of bring up, there is this, and it's partly, it does show up in FLUX, but I think it's a much bigger issue than just change. How we think about power, control, etc.
Yeah.
When you giving up, ceding some of that power, and for you, what you were doing, you were signaling that you trust her and you believe in her. And what's interesting is you're aware of the fact that she may leave, but what you're doing is not just helping her pursue her full potential and reach her dreams and so forth, but there's a kind of trust and loyalty, for lack of a better term, that she's going to continue to come back to you. She's, whether or not you're working together, and I think of this a little bit like revolving doors, where people with portfolio careers, if you help them curate their portfolio and they figure out, this means I need to spend some time somewhere else sometime. But what ends up often happening is there's a boomerang effect of, like, if they really love what they're doing, they're going to come back and continue to work with you, maybe not in a full-time employee fashion, but they will continue to add value to what you do. But it requires, like, ceding power. So kind of like going slow means going fast, or, fast is the Navy SEAL saying that I'm going to botch, but, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. There is also this sense of when you cede power, you actually gain real power. If it's coercive power of, like, I control your salary, so I get to control your every hour, that just doesn't rub people the right way. But if you can say, so there's an element of trust, but also an element of how do we find a win-win here? And a win for me is actually when you succeed. Yeah. As opposed to seeing it only through the lens of quarterly returns or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
April, what's so great about this book, I think, is that it's going to open up some really great discussions, both personally within families and, relationships. But I think even in the corporate setting, I mean, a team could say, hey, let's take a look at this, and you've got, eight different components, and you could just dive into one at a time and say, hey, what's this mean to our team, to us as individuals? And by doing that, you're really telling your team, you know what, I care about you as a human. And, one of the 8 is be all the more human. But before we go, and we're running out of time a little bit, the one I wanted you, I mean, if you would be willing to talk about a little bit that I think is intriguing, is to see what's invisible. That's one of the superpowers you talk about. What, I'd love to be able to become invisible. So what is it that you're trying to get at here?
So, and thank you for your kind words. And I will say, what's interesting, I'm walking a very fine line. I'm mostly known in the business world as being a strategist and an advisor and a futurist. So FLUX is technically, it is a business book. But what I love is there's just so much self-awareness, self-help. I'm looking at this from the lens of any and all professional growth or organizational value has to come through personal growth. It's from the inside out. So thank you for bringing that up, because it is very much designed for teams and organizations, but it requires that bigger picture lens. See what's invisible. This basically says that when the future seems blurry or uncertain, we just don't know what to do, rather than focusing on what's front and center, what's visible, what society has taught us to focus on, we actually need to look really carefully and clearly at what's invisible, what's on the edges, what's on the periphery. And again, this is sort of abstract, so I'll give you some examples. But this, like, what are we trained not to see? So this is what's fascinating, because every person on the planet, whether we know it or not, we are trained or taught to see some things and to not see others. And sometimes that can be ignoring them. Sometimes that can be actively pretending they're not there. And there are lots of ways this shows up. Invisible value, invisible talent. I will say, in an organizational setting, there's a huge connection here with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We focus on who's speaking at the table. I'm actually looking at who's not at the table.
Yeah.
Who's, it's that, see what's invisible. And why I say it's important to see what's invisible, because in many cases, it's been there all along. That value, that talent, that capability, it's always been there. And we've been trained to see it as not there. And invisible is a bit, it can be a tricky term in some cases, but like, I want to be clear, it's not dropping from the sky. It's always been there, and we actually need to breathe oxygen into it. But from a futurist perspective, I'm always looking at, okay, what's on the periphery? What's on the edge? What are most people not looking at today? But in 5 years' time, it's going to be front and center, and we can't deny it. And an example, I spent many years working on the sharing economy, which now, caveat, the sharing economy has a much broader definition than we typically think of. But when we think about underutilized excess capacity in space, in assets, in people's time, right? All of these things can be unlocked. And so often we'll use the example of like just Airbnb, right? The founders of Airbnb saw value in underutilized space in people's homes. Hotels did not see that value. They thought it was crazy and no one would ever do it. Now you've got Airbnb, which has, it's bigger than the 5 largest hotel chains combined because they saw value that was invisible to others. Right. But this plays out in lots of different ways. And I think talent and skills is also just a key. There is so much talent all around us, but if it doesn't have the credential, or it doesn't look quite right, so to speak. Again, that's all we've been trained to see. What does right or wrong look like? That if we can unlock that, it helps us navigate flux.
You made me think of 3 things. I've seen some CEOs, successful CEOs, say the best thing they can do is travel, get out of their comfort zone and travel and develop a different perspective. I think about James Clausen at the Darden School of Business, who really talked about a leader's point of view, having a different perspective. And I even think about Peter Senge's work, on the ladder of inference, that we all might observe, be in the same room, but we all select different things to pay attention to. And how can we be cognizant that we're not in a pattern, in a habit, and we're coming out of our comfort zone. So I think these are great.
This is great. And
these are challenges to us that I think you're highlighting.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Senge is in the book, but also MBA curriculum actually shows up in the book. Why is it if we want to breed or cultivate, an enormous, like just a range of business leaders, take a look at traditional MBA curriculum. Yeah. And this is an example I call out in the book. And, and again, I say this respectfully, that there are lots of great thinkers from lots of different backgrounds. Why is it that 99% of all MBA curriculum is written by white men? Yet there have been business leaders from all stripes, all walks of life for a very long time. And so actually one of the examples, Lara Huang, who is, she's a professor actually at HBS, and she came up with a well-balanced meal reading list for MBAs, where it's a full curriculum for an MBA, an entire, MBA degree, but she's pulling in the perspectives and the people who've been doing this work, but they weren't seen in a traditional or Ivy League or whatever, MBA.
What's her name again? I want to make sure
Lara Huang, Huang.
Huang.
Mm-hmm. And it's called the Well-Balanced Meal MBA reading list.
Yeah, because I'm actually teaching a course right now at the University of Colorado to MBA students, and I'm thinking about, I don't know that I've really looked at my reading list as to who wrote things. I'm looking at a topic, so you gave me something to think about here.
Well, and this is a side note. A common friend of ours, Todd Satterston, he did the same thing. He said, I've written the 100 best business books of all time, right? He'd never thought about, and again, this isn't a criticism. I think it's that sense of you just sort of go after what's best selling, and you don't think about necessarily the history or the background of the author. There wasn't really any diversity on the list.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was a wake up call for him. And so what I love though, is that Laura, in this case, she's tackling the same topics: leadership, marketing, finance. Like, it's all the core content is there. We're just getting a much richer set of voices behind it.
I was just looking to see if I had that 100 best. It's somewhere else on my book from Todd. I was going to put his book up there too.
I was like, I hope that, I know we need to wrap up, but I was like, I hope that's not the signal.
No, I was like, I wonder if I can grab Todd's book and show it, but it's not there. It's somewhere in there. But April, before we go, I wonder if if there's a final thought you've got or a challenge you'd like to put out there to the folks watching and the people that will watch, because they're all being recorded on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Yeah, thank you. So my favorite closing tagline, I think, these days is that when everything is in flux, everything can benefit from a flux mindset. So I know we've dove into several different topics today, which I love, but for each person, my challenge is always, have you spent time thinking about your relationship to change? And in particular, what are those changes you really struggle with? And start pulling on that thread, because you're not just going to learn something about yourself, you're going to learn skills that are useful for life, and Flux can help.
Yeah. And my takeaway is this is the slowest it's ever going to be. That's a good one. Okay, for everybody.
Absolutely.
April's book is on Amazon and all these other great places. Flux
and if you want to learn more about Flux, and so, like, I've tried to make a lot of the information just easy to access. Fluxmindset.com also it has the book, you can get it there, but also just other articles, resources, pique your interest.
Yeah. Well, thanks for investing 3 years of your life plus decades to put something out to help all of us.
Thank you so much, Jan. It's great to be here.
All right. Talk to you later, April.
Bye.